So you started your career at a community development corporation in Cleveland. Then you spent 10 years at what was then La Raza, now Unidos. That's where we got to know each other. Then Janis climbed the ranks of philanthropy at JP Morgan Chase, and she became the president of the foundation. And then was there one more stop before Treasury? No.
Nope. Then to Treasury.
And then to Treasury in the role that you're in now. So what is this role? This is the first, I believe. The first counselor for racial equity. What does that mean? Tell us a little bit more about your day job. What do you do every day? And what are you trying to achieve in this role?
Sure, thank you. Well, first of all, congratulations on everybody on this event, and we were talking backstage about how lovely it is to be back in person. So appreciate you having me here. So Counselor for Racial Equity, hopefully by now everybody is well aware of the level of priority that this administration has put on equity. And for the Treasury Department, the secretary and the deputy secretary were very clear that they wanted somebody who was going to have day-to-day eyes on this agenda, right? And that's how we make sure, like, the commitment was there. They worked on the day one strategy, and then they invited me in and said, essentially, we want to leave no stone unturned. We want to make sure that we're looking at all the tools and levers that Treasury has to advance racial equity. And so you can think of this work broadly in three buckets. There's the work that I think probably comes to mind from people first and foremost, which is the policy work. How do we infuse a racial equity perspective into the programs and policy? I know we're going to get into this Treasury being responsible for $1 trillion under the American Rescue Plan, several $100 billion worth of tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act. So there's a lot to do there. It also includes thinking about the department itself and how it reflects the diversity of our country, how we're thinking about our purchasing power, our procurement, for example. And then third, I also think it's really important for us in this work to think about how we're engaging with communities, how we're bringing ground intelligence into the building. Treasury is structured differently. If you were to think about some of my peer economic agencies, SBA, Commerce, HUD, they have field offices, right? They have structures that take them down to communities and allow them to interact. Treasury does not have that. So it's critically important in my mind that we are creating structural ways for us to get proximate to communities, to stay humble, to bring that ground intelligence that lines up next to the really sophisticated economic data that we have, but allows us to interpret it and understand it in ways that reflect real impact in communities. So those are my tent poles. I know we're going to get into more of all of that work, but that should give you a sense. It's pretty broad in terms of how it gives me this bird's eye view of the ways in which our department can help build an economy that really is working for everyone.
Well, and I'd never really thought about it before, this notion that you don't have local presence aside from the dollars in people's wallets, perhaps, right? There's no local presence like these other agencies. That's really interesting. And you mentioned lining up or bringing in that intelligence alongside the economic data and tools that you have. I'm curious, how have the economists at Treasury taken to this non-traditional, non-data-driven intelligence, and do they understand how these issues really need to ultimately fold into their own economic analyses?
Yeah, I think we're seeing several things that are happening at the department at once. So you have a new Office of Recovery Programs that was responsible for running that $1 trillion of American Rescue Plan funds. You now have an implementation office for the Inflation Reduction Act that are partners, and they're thinking about, they're partners of mine certainly across the building as well, but their mandates really take them straight to the ground as well. So that's given us multiple touch points and tools, I think, to do that work. And I'm pushing on a lot of open doors, but I'm also the person every day that's like, and who are we talking to, and what kind of intelligence are we getting, and how are we breaking down information barriers? How are we making sure we are communicating well? So I think we are doing this work at a time where we have sets of structures that are enabling this work. I think what's also important is what the biggest, I can't speak to whether it's a change because I'm brand new. I'm coming up on my 2-year anniversary. But what I've seen happen in my time there is the way that this community intelligence also shapes the sets of questions that the economists are asking. So for example, we've put out original research looking at the distribution of tax expenditures, who's benefiting, and breaking that down by race. That had never been done before. Treasury and a team of researchers partnered on a study, a little painful, but very, very painful and very real, showing that Black and non-Black, the disparity between Black and non-Black tax filers in their audit treatments. We put out research on the economic impact of, the distribution of economic impact payments, also by race. So by bringing in the concerns and experiences of the community, we also get to ask, I think, a different set of questions that then shed light on where we have policy caps and we need to drive to solutions. Audit disparities being an obvious one.
Yeah, so I appreciate you giving examples of that research. We spent time yesterday talking about the newest update of our annual financial health pulse data, and the fact that the burden of financial instability falls disproportionately on underrepresented communities, on women, on people of color, on people with disabilities, people with different sexual orientations. In fact, if I have the data right, there's a 15-point gap between the share of Black and white people who are financially unhealthy. Not surprising, but sobering nonetheless. You talked a little bit about some of the tools that Treasury has and has had. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that. And what do you think is the role of Treasury and of the government as a whole as it relates to closing these gaps?
Yeah. To take those in reverse order, I think it's important for us to be clear that we have a history of policies that have created gaps. So there's a very clear responsibility of the government and from a public policy perspective to take affirmative steps to address harm that was caused. And again, I think we're in despite all the things that are really hard about our moment that we're in, and we could probably have a couple of sessions and maybe over wine talk about all the things that are hard about the moment that we're in. From a policy perspective, we also have a suite of once-in-a-generation legislation that gives us a set of tools to work with to affirmatively address harm. So in addition to fostering an equitable recovery through the American Rescue Plan, we're now looking at the CHIPS and Science Act, we're looking at the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And so through that, I mean, we haven't had this kind of holistic, full court press, public investment in our economy in generations. We are in the middle of building our next middle class. And it is incumbent upon us to then think about who gets to be in that middle class. And I don't have to tell this room that we have a history of people of color, in particular, not benefiting from public investments, being intentionally excluded from those public investments. So that's our work right in front of us. I do want to say specifically to the financial health question as well, Treasury is now kicked off a process to outline a national financial strategy, financial inclusion strategy. We've never had that. And forgive me if in this room that sounds like, where have you been? Since everybody in this room has been working on this issue for decades, and you yourselves and certainly the Financial Health Network have put forward affirmative visions of what this should be. But to your point, from a federal perspective, right? We have not articulated that, and I think there's an important role for us to play to help paint that North Star and then call everybody to their role in pushing forward towards that vision.
Yeah, and I want to call out our friends from the Aspen Institute, who I know have been working very hard in partnership with you and others to make this plan a reality. And every time I talk to Ida Rademacher, who some of you may know, she says, we're calling it financial inclusion because that's the words that people in Congress know, and that's how the other G20 countries talk about it. But we really mean everything you're talking about. So I appreciate your caveat there, but I completely understand. We shouldn't let the language get in the way of the important work.
Totally agree.
That needs to be done. So you've mentioned several times just this once in a generation kind of investment. I think it's $20 billion all told. I mean, that's a staggering sum of money, even for this country. How will you know if it's working?
Yep. So there's a couple things. I mean, first of all, the vision around what is it that we're trying to accomplish. Again, forgive me for being really elementary, but I don't think we can take some of these things for granted. Do we have a shared understanding of the problem? And therefore, do we have a shared understanding of the solution? We do not have, I think, 100% agreement on the problems, but I think we've got enough there that we have agreed that we need to invest in people, places, and infrastructure that have long been overlooked, marginalized, and frankly underestimated. And this is the economic philosophy that our secretary has put forward, that is our biggest path to growth, is going to those marginalized places by investing in people that have long lacked the resources they need to really unlock their economic potential. And that's how we're going to get to the sustainable economy that we're all looking for. So that's the vision, and I think it's important to be clear about that, because then, working backwards from there are really intentional policy decisions. And I'm happy to give a few examples of what that looks like. So we recently released final guidance on the low-income community bonus tax credit for small solar and wind installation. I know that was really long and wonky, but essentially what we're trying to do is get more clean energy into low-income communities, and you can get a 10 to 20% bonus credit for investing in solar and wind technology in low-income communities. Okay, so first challenge is we know that just locating in low-income communities does not mean that low-income communities actually benefit from that. And so across the categories, we put a heavy weight on community solar that requires that at least 51% of the beneficiaries be low-income families. That's one thing that we did. We also created a 50% set aside in a competitive tax credit for emerging market businesses that are serving their local communities, for projects that are in persistent poverty counties, and for projects that are driven by mission-driven entities, by nonprofits. What that did in a lottery system, a concern could have been that we just concentrate solar where it already is, where the capacity already is. But our goal is by creating these carve-outs, by creating some enabling conditions, that we're going to allow places that don't yet have this technology to have the time and develop the resources and the skill set to do this. I was just at the Hispanic Chamber yesterday. I presented to the Black Chamber a couple of weeks ago, and I asked in that room, how many of you have applied for a tax credit for your business? And so far, across all the presentations I've done, I've had 5 hands go up. It's weird. It's weird. Applying for tax credits is weird and it's hard. So we have to create the space to allow emerging businesses that want to compete in this environment to learn how to do that, get the tools and resources. Okay, so I wonked out for a second on this low income.
Let me just say that, do you know how much spam I get from people asking if I or FHN want to apply for tax credit? I see a lot of nodding heads. So unfortunately, either we're getting spammed about it, but we're not getting the really good information about it.
Which is the other part, like building in the consumer protection on this. Anytime you have a program, again, forgive me for telling you things that everybody in this room knows and works on, when you build a program that focuses specifically on low-income communities, it also creates some vulnerabilities. So this is a tiny piece. I wonked out on this tiny piece, but I wanted to give you an example of the ways in which we're creating intentionality about who gets access to the programs. Okay, I know I'm going on, but I want to hit this last point because it's setting, how will we know we'll be successful? We set the vision, we are taking these intentional policy steps, but we also know that intention and impact don't always line up. So measuring and collecting the data is incredibly important for knowing whether or not we're hitting our own aspirations.
Yes.
And we are making a huge effort to make sure that we are collecting data by race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, and geography, wherever possible. Happy to talk about examples there too. But that is how we will then know, are the programs actually doing the thing that we said that they would do? And to the extent that we're able to iterate on the programs and initiatives as we go along, and also frankly make sure that people like you all have the information to ask tough questions, to hold us accountable, and to think about alternative solutions when we're not hitting the mark.
I'm glad that you went all the way down the rabbit hole there, because it's so rare to hear people talk about exactly how they're going to hold themselves or the entity accountable. And in this moment of just severe lack of trust in institutions of all kinds, and in particularly in government, it's really heartening to hear that you guys have thought about all that, especially since these, with $20 billion of investment, right? It's going to take a few years to kind of see that bear fruit completely, long after you're probably gone. And so...
But also, I would encourage folks to go to the Treasury website now. All of the reporting data for the American Rescue Plan is publicly available. So we have demographic information on the emergency rental assistance program, the homeowner assistance program, capital projects, broadband, state and local fiscal recovery, the plans for every one of your local jurisdictions that have received federal money, the plans and how they're reporting against those plans, it's all publicly available. You can go look at this data. We're certainly pushing it out, but you all should be looking at it. We've had great examples of where local practitioners and advocates have looked at their state and local fiscal recovery plans and pushed for change. There is a requirement around community engagement, back to building in some structural pieces to bring community intelligence into this work. And we know that that is making a difference in terms of how those programs are being implemented.
So that makes me think of something that we didn't discuss in advance. So hopefully I'm not putting you on the spot too much, but how do we help the private sector do the kind of data gathering and disaggregation in order to measure their impact that the government, through your efforts and others, is now able to do, which was already complicated before and is even more challenging given the anti-woke environment and the politicization of this issue. What have you got for us?
So I will offer up Janis's views here.
Okay.
Just Janis's views. Data should be one of the least controversial things that we do, because we can't know. We can't know if discrimination is happening or not happening. We can't poke and prod at the effectiveness of programs if we don't have that data. And so in in the current political environment, I think we are still, and I would encourage others to still press into the data and be as data driven as possible, which is why, just to come full circle for a moment, what data and who's asking the questions and which questions get answered is also really important, because we know we can cut data a lot of different ways. I know from having sat at a financial institution, from having tried to collect demographic data, probably from many of you in the room, that this has its own set of challenges. There are regulatory challenges that I won't speak to in collecting certain kinds of data. But I will say, from a funder perspective, when I sat across the table from probably many of you, or you sat with the program officers on our team, and we said, we want more data, sometimes you were like, like that's a lot of information, a lot of data collection, a lot of reporting. We tried really hard to balance the burden of data collection. That is a real thing. One thing that I would love for us to think about are what are some of the back-end structures that could really enable us to do stronger data collection across our nonprofit work, also across our private sector work. For example, we've seen some of the trades step in to aggregate data across different corporate sectors as a way that maybe anonymizes against a specific company, but still allows data to be available. So there may be some creative data infrastructure plays that we could collectively be looking at, maybe a place for collaboration.
So let's build on the collaboration idea. As I introduced you at the beginning, you have sat in a variety of different seats. You have kind of worked in all sectors. Now that you've done government. We all talk about public-private and the importance of collaboration and and isn't that nice? But it is really going to take all of us. These are like monumental challenges. So how do you think about, how do you make those collaborations really work and be meaningful, as opposed to just the thing that gets announced at the conference and it's then?
Yeah. So I think critically important is that we all know our role and our piece of the puzzle, and that we're very clear about that. And then we need really good conveners. And that's not always us. Sometimes it's us, but it's not always us. Sometimes it's you. Sometimes it's you guys. So whoever it is, right, we need a convener, and we need to knit together the competencies that we have as institutions. And I'll give you an example of where we've been doing that in some of our partnerships. So the Emergency Capital Investment Program, I know I keep throwing out wonky terms. ECIP, Emergency Capital Investment Program, was an $8.4 billion investment in CDFIs and MDI depositories. Tier 1 equity capital, or equity like in the case of credit unions, to further enable the work that they do. That equity investment created a big need for deposits. Had you asked some of these institutions even just a couple years before, that wasn't necessarily the thing that they needed. They wanted the lending capital.
Right.
Okay, they got the lending capital, and now all of a sudden they need deposits. Whereas I saw Angie back there. I see you, Angie. Sitting around the table with a couple of Angie's colleagues at Bank of America, they said, this is something we can all do. We can help raise deposits for these institutions. It's going to further their mission, allow them to online. So a group of corporations, which includes Bank of America, the Economic Opportunity Coalition, committed to and has successfully raised $1 billion in deposits. Of course, that quickly inspired leaders to say, what about 5 billion? What about 10? So we're going to continue our march for further deposits for the institutions. But this was our money doing our thing, and the private corporation's money doing their thing, and it wouldn't work otherwise. We would not be able to maximize that investment. Just one small example where I think when we stack up our competencies, that's when we will be more than the sum of our parts.
Got it. So we have very little time. I'm going to sneak in one last lightning round question. You've been at this a long time, as long as I have been. As you look back and you look ahead, what are the one or two things you're most proud of, most important accomplishments, do you think? And What are the one or two opportunities that lie ahead that you really want us to all lean into?
So things that I'm most proud of, if I think both in Treasury but also across this work, is the sophistication of the work that we do. I know the work that we do is really hard, and sometimes it feels like you're trying to get the water out of the boat, but we have become increasingly very sophisticated about how we do this work. Our mission-driven institutions have bandwidth and balance sheets, and we have an absorptive capacity that we didn't have 15 and 20 years ago. And that gets me really excited, because I think we have now that capacity going into what I'm really excited about for the future, which is this moment that we're in where we are building the next middle class. We have the tools in front of us, and I wake up every day thinking about how do we take all of the competencies, how do we stack up this sophistication, take everything that we've learned so that we don't leave anything on the table. I don't know when we will get a chance like this again with this kind of public investment. How do we make sure that we are driving in a way that ends our disparities? And if we aren't laser focused on that, we know a lack of intentionality will actually exacerbate our disparities. So we're in a moment where we have a sweeping set of tools in front of us, and I think it's on us to make sure we're seizing that opportunity and driving with clarity and intentionality.
All right, well, if that didn't energize you, then I don't know what will. Janis, thank you so much. Help me thank Janis for being here.